everyone, today I will be showing you how I turned this small tank into this, a mini Paludarium for my green tree frog.
Complete with water slide.
To start off, of course we're going to need this small tank. You can get an idea of how small it is compared to the size of my hand here. For this build, instead of adding layers of earth, we will be building a base that will hold everything together. For that, we will be needing a piece of corrugated plastic. We need to cut this to the right shape so that it sits well inside the tank. First, we measure the length and then the width of the tank. Whatever your measurements may be, I recommend leaving about a centimeter of extra material so that way we can go back and trim it down if needed. Now to add our measurements to the plastic and mark it down using a marker. Remember, we left a little bit of extra material on here, so it's okay if your lines aren't perfectly straight. With all that set, it's now time to cut it out. With our piece cut out, it is now time to check to see if it will fit inside of our tank. As you can see, it's having trouble going inside, so we will trim a little bit of it off until it fits inside nicely. Once you have that done, you will take it back out for the next step. Using a razor, I cut our sheet of plastic down the middle, but be careful to only cut the top layer. We still want it in one piece, we just need it to be able to fold. Now fold it over and see what it looks like inside of the tank. Now take it back out because we still need to cut some more sections out of it. Now here's the part where it might get a little bit tricky, because one section will be for our pump and waterfall, and the other section will be for our land and soil. The right side is where I want to add the soil, so I want to be sure to leave that side larger than the left. Now using a blade or some scissors, cut it down the middle till you get to the fold crease. This next part will be sort of like putting a puzzle together. The left side is still attached to the large sheet, but with the right side we went with the same process of cutting it into two pieces, one large and one smaller. We will then take our smaller piece and glue it down on the back that has our fold. This small piece will hold up the flap and will leave us a small open area on the bottom. Now this larger piece, we will be using it to give us a little bit more surface area, but you don't want to glue this one down just yet. We want to add in the larger section first. Then afterwards, find a spot to glue in the piece. Now here's what it should look like. I stuck the small piece onto it using a good amount of hot glue. And be sure to leave the bottom section open because it's where we will be passing our water tubing through. Now once again, add it to the tank. Now to find a spot for our larger piece, and once we do, we will glue it down. Even though we have all that down, we still need to make an entry hole for our water pump. This is my favorite type of pump to use because not only is it strong, it is also conveniently a USB powered. Now to take our base out one last time. And now we will place the pump on top and see exactly how much we need to cut in order to pass the pump through. Now once we cut that little section out, I went ahead and glued it to the bottom for an extra bit of support. And be sure that the pump is able to go in at all angles, thus making it easily removable should we ever need to replace it. Before adding it back to the tank, be sure to make two holes in it, one for the inlet and one for the outlet. Now to glue on our base to the tank to keep it from moving. Once the glue has dried and everything is in its place, we will begin to fill in the small cracks on the bottom and sides of the tank. For that, we will be using some black aquarium safe silicone. Now this tube is too big to fit inside of the tank, so I will be applying the silicone bit by bit using a stick. This did take me a good while, so I'll just go ahead and skip to the part where I'm finished. Be sure to use a good amount and really fill in those cracks. The silicone also acts as another layer of glue to help hold everything together. The silicone tends to have a really strong odor, so I recommend doing this outside or in a well-ventilated area. Now the reason we needed to build a very firm structure is because we needed a base strong enough to hold up our waterfall. And to make it, I will be using these small pieces of dragon stone. These stones look really well in terrariums and fish tanks, but unfortunately they're not very light. To begin making our waterfall, I will stack the rocks together in a way that looks the best. Fortunately for me, I found a piece of stone that has a natural channel already built onto it, so I will build it in a way so the water can flow down it. But once you have a pretty good idea of how you want to set it up, we can move on to the next step, which is gluing it together. Now for these stones, I actually don't recommend using hot glue. Instead, we will be using some bits of cotton and super glue. And here I thought I was recording me adding the glue to the cotton, but it turns out I was just barely out of frame, so I'm sorry for that. Now to just add the cotton in between our rocks and squeeze together. And hold it firmly in place until it dries. We will have to do that to every piece, so I will go ahead and just skip to the part where I finished. And here we have our little waterfall structure. Once we make sure that everything is firm and there's no loose rocks, we can go ahead and add it to our tank. But we're not done yet. This is just to see if our base will hold and to find a good position in which to set our waterfall. Once we found a good place to set it, it is time to add the finishing touches to our waterfall. Now to fill in the cracks and turn this into one solid piece, we will be using some expanding spray foam. Be sure to fill it in large areas where you see cracks in between the rocks. And once you've done that, let it sit for about an hour to allow the foam to expand and dry. Now that the foam is dry and fluffy, you can go ahead and start ripping out the outer layer. For the larger pieces, I recommend cutting them out slowly so that way you don't harm the top surface of the rocks. Once you rip off the bigger pieces, there will be smaller chunks left on the bottom. We can pick those out using a little pair of tweezers. So let me go ahead and do that and I'll show you what I was left with. Now that I finished picking out the smaller pieces, you can see that the spray foam is still visible. To cover that up, we will be using some more black silicone. Since it was in a tight spot, I used a tiny screwdriver to help me apply the silicone. You'll want to do this to all sides in which the spray foam is still visible. Now it may look weird, but that's because we're not done just yet. Next we will be covering up the black silicone using tiny pieces of crushed up dragonstone. You could break off a chunk and crush it yourself, but I'm just using the smaller bits and flakes I found at the bottom of the packaging. Now once you dump a good amount of flakes onto the silicone, be sure to pat it down so it really gets in there, and dump the extra bits back into our little cup here. And now to repeat the same process onto every area that we applied the silicone. And once we are done, it is time to take our little waterfall and our tank and sit outside in the sun for 3 days. Now that the silicone in our waterfall and tank is fully dried, we can begin to start adding the layers that will hold our land area. Here you'll see why I needed this area open down here. For the bottom layer, I will be using pieces of filter mesh. I need just enough to cover up this open area we have here. I start by cutting out a large piece and folding it together until it reaches the proper height that I need. Now to cut it to shape and add it to the bottom. I added a small bit of glue to each layer to keep it from opening up on itself. Once that's done, it is time to pass the hose through the hole. I have the hose sitting on top so you can see it, but try to tuck it under one of the folds in the mesh. As you can see, I ran a good bit of hose through the hole, but it's better to run too much than too little, especially since we will only be able to run this through once. Now for layer number 2, we will be using some weed barrier. This will help separate the two layers and also cover up our hose. Now I did carefully add a little bit of glue to the corners because it kept folding in on itself. But once we got that done, I can show you what I will be using for my first layer of substrate. For that, I will be using some fluvial volcano soil. And as you can see on the labeling there, it is very mineral rich and good substrate for aquatic plants and even shrimp. So this will work perfectly for our environment. Unlike sand, these come in tiny round pellets, which are basically small balls of compressed soil, so try not to crush them. Now to add in a good bit, and spread it around to help even it out. And once that's done, I will add another piece of weed barrier right on top. As you can see, the second piece of weed barrier is bigger and overlaps the top, but that's okay because we still need to cover up the holes we have in front. And for that, I will add yet another piece of weed barrier, so that way it covers up the holes and helps hide the white background. Here I have a really bad glare, so I'm trying to do my best to show you what it looks like. But once that's in place, we can begin to build what's going to be our rock wall. And for that, we will be using some black lava rock. Now if you've seen my videos before, you know that I love using these rocks for their versatility and because they're very lightweight. I will be adding in one rock at a time and gluing one onto another until I have a nice good rock wall that covers up our background. The ones that are stacked are glued together, but the ones on the far right, those I have left loose. As for the hose, I just passed it up to the top until one end was barely sticking out. But of course we don't need all of it, so we'll go ahead and trim it down and add this T onto it. One end will go into the pump itself, one will go to the outlet, and one will go to the waterfall. I used pieces of slightly bigger tube so that the smaller tube can go inside and I can go ahead and glue them. Now I will position the pump and connect the hoses and show you what that looks like. Now with the pump set and all the hoses connected, I went ahead and added some water so I can show you how strong the current will be. This top hose is the one that will be running through our waterfall. And the other output hose is circulating the water just behind those lava rocks. Here I've added a bit of mesh to help with the glare. Now I ran the hose through and under the top rock. Now to turn it on and see what it looks like. Perfect. You want it to where it sort of just trickles down and it's not making tidal waves in the water. Now some of you familiar with habitat builds might be wondering why I started off with the land and water area first instead of the background. Well, the reason behind that is along with the waterfall, I also want the background to be removable. If you want to integrate yours into the back glass, that's perfectly fine, but I just found that it would get in the way of the build. But if not, here I'll show you how you can build your own custom background. Here I have a slab of paper fruit holder I got from my local farmer's market, and I will start by applying a large thin napkin over the top of it. My background will be small, but depending on how big yours will be, you might want to use several pieces of napkin. Now to spray it with a good amount of water and allow the paper to form the shape. The wet napkin will contour to any shape that you spread it over, so you can try this method onto other different surfaces to see which one you like best. But if you don't have anything like that, doing it over a piece of wet cardboard will work just the same. Now using some more spray foam, you will begin to shape out a perimeter that is slightly bigger than the background of your tank. My spray bottle got a bit clogged up from the previous use, so I just ripped off the top and started spreading it around like cheese whiz. Be sure to use a good amount and to get the pattern as close to each other as possible. Let it sit for a few minutes, but don't let it dry up all the way. Once you see it's about halfway dry, wet your hand or use a glove and start pressing it down. This will help build up the shape and also help get some of the air bubbles out in between the foam, so that way it doesn't foam up too much. Once you've pressed it down as much as you can, go ahead and flip it over and start tearing out the larger pieces of wet paper. Now we still have little bits of paper left over, but you can use a dry sponge or a folded up piece of filter mesh to go ahead and scrape it out. Since the paper was wet, it didn't stick to the foam, and the mesh is just coarse enough to where it rips out the paper but doesn't mess up the background. And by the time you're finished doing all that, it should be fully dry. And once it has, you can begin trimming out the outer edges. It's not a perfect square, but it'll work just fine. Now to press it behind the back of the tank, and with the marker, trace out any extra area that needs to be cut away. Even though we marked it, it might not fit in perfectly the first time, so just keep trimming away at it bit by bit until it finally fits in there. Now that I have it all trimmed up and fitting in there nicely, you can see that this side sits flush with the glass, but this side isn't as much, and that's because I want to try to hide the power cord and a bit of the water hose in between the crack of the background and the glass. This will allow me to tuck the hose back a bit for when I add the waterfall. Speaking of which, now that I have the background set in place and I add my little waterfall back in, it pushes it forward and it won't set in the position I had it set in originally. If I didn't have it, that's fine, I could just leave it as is. But since that's not the case, I will have to take the background out and begin shaping it little by little until I get the shape, or at least as close to the shape of the rocks as possible. Now after repeating the process of taking out and cutting it, I'm finally able to cut away a shape of the waterfall. And as you can see, my cutting wasn't 100% perfect because there's a small open area right here, but I can easily cover that up with a piece of filter mesh to keep anything from climbing its way behind the background. Now for this next step, we will be applying a good amount of silicone on the side that we want to be the face of our habitat. Again, I recommend doing this outside or in a well-ventilated area. I usually apply this by hand, but since I had just run out of gloves, I will be using a plastic spoon instead. I find it works perfectly considering that this thing already looks like a slice of bread. It also happens to be a magic spoon because after a few more spreads, it's now completely covered. Now with our background completely covered with black silicone, it is time to bring in what will be going on top of it. Here I have a tray of dried coconut husk, and we will just be setting this to the side and sprinkle as much of it on top of it as we can. We will sprinkle the husk over it until it completely covers the silicone. We don't want to see any black areas, so be sure to cover it well and press it on so it sticks. I will be adding a small addition to this background, and to make it, I got a sauce cup and I cut it in half and covered the outside of it with some black silicone as well. I will be doing the same thing to this one. First I'm going to roll it up here to get some of the larger chunks, and then sprinkle it on with some more of the finer bits. I'll press it on there a bit more, and again, if you have any gloves, use them. It'll help keep the silicone from getting on your hand. But once it's nicely covered, this is what you're left with. Now to take these outside to dry in the sun for 2 to 3 days. Once it's dry and you see that none of the husk is falling off, that's how you know it's ready to add to the background. I knew I must have made a pretty convincing background when I saw we had a visitor already trying to claim it as its home. Sorry little buddy, I'm afraid if I add you to this enclosure you might get eaten. So I'll be sure to let you back outside later, okay? I will be using bits of double-sided tape to stick it onto the back glass, because remember, I want this background to be sturdy but also removable. Now with the background in place, we can begin adding in the soil. But first I will be adding another little bit of filter mesh on top of the pump just to keep it from clogging up from any large debris that might fall in. First add in a thin layer of fluval pellets, And next I will be adding in the bioactive soil. I will be adding it in a bit at a time because I don't want it falling into our water area. Bioactive soil is available in pretty much any pet store nowadays, but I make my own, and this mixture consists of coconut husk, sphagnum moss, bits of broken down bark, bits of broken down wood chips, leaf litter, and a hint of sand. I also wet it prior to adding it because I want to make sure I compress it in there very well. Otherwise, if you add it when it's dry, it will begin to expand when wet and it might end up spilling into the water area, which is why I like adding it in pre-soaked. Once you have that done, you can begin adding in your plants. But aside from plants, I have something special that I will be adding to this enclosure. Now, as the title suggests, I will be adding in the charcoal, but not just any charcoal, but some rich moss covered charcoal. I have been growing this and other chunks of moss for over 3 months now, and I think it looks amazing. There's even a little fern growing out of it. It started out as a tiny clipping and grew into 4 whole stems. Up close, it reminds me of kind of like a little dinosaur world. But for this build, I will be adding in the bits from this little container that even has little bits of fire moss growing out of it. I don't want to break the big one apart, which is why I'll be using these smaller pieces, but they are both the same species of moss. So let's go ahead and add them in. As I was adding in the charcoal, I also noticed that one of my rocks here was loose. So afterwards I went back to glue it down properly in case any of you were wondering. These clumps already had a good amount of dirt on them, so again I was careful to not dump any in the water area, and was also careful when pressing them into the dirt because they are still fragile. They're only being held together by tiny roots from the moss. Look at that. I think that looks really nice in there. Next, I will be adding these small driftwood branches onto our land area and into the water area. Now to add in the half a cup we made earlier, what I done is I got a toothpick and I cut it in half and glued one piece to each side of the cup with the pointy part sticking out, so that way we can poke it into our foam background. First I glued it on using some hot glue, and then I went over it with some super glue and sprinkled some more fine coconut husk to cover it up a bit. Now to find a nice spot for it and add it to the background. Now to add some more of these volcano pellets to the bottom of the tank. And next adding some water. Now to add in the aquatic plants. Here I have some root clippings of Anacharis and some hornwort plant. I hope I pronounced those right. The hornwort plant will grow just fine in open water. But the Anacharis has little roots that like to grow into dirt, so I will try to wedge these in between the rocks a bit. Now to add in the water cleanup crew. First we will be adding in this tiny snail. Not sure why he started floating at first, but trust me, he's alive and well. Now to add a bit of sphagnum moss into our cup up here. And spray some water to get it all soaked up, and we might as well spray the whole area as well. Next to add in some little dried up leaves. And small sections of some faux vine. Now let's turn the waterfall back on to get some water circulating. And next to add in some vine and fern clippings. Be sure to pluck them at the roots, otherwise they won't grow. And now some nice fluffy stems of asparagus fern. Now with the land area complete, we can finally add the last addition to our water area. Here we have two beautiful red cherry shrimps. I will be adding in one male and one female in hopes that they will probably reproduce. I went with red cherries instead of the usual ghost shrimp because their red color will really pop against the black backgrounds. Now the water that I added to this paludarium is the same water that the shrimps were already living in, so they are already accustomed to the water temperature and conditions. So if you want to use shrimps in your setup as well, be sure to properly acclimate them to the water before you add them. If you don't, it's more than certain that they will go belly up. But as you can see, these guys look pretty happy, already exploring and swimming around their new environment. And that wraps up our build. All we need to do now is add the main resident to our little paludarium. Here we have my adorable little green tree frog. Now he was living in this tank before, but his setup was a bit mediocre at best. So I'm glad I was able to build him a proper home this time. Now he is a little bit of an escape artist, so I will be adding him and then quickly covering it up. There we go. And as you can see, he almost instantly blends in with all the greens. You probably wouldn't be able to tell there was a frog in here at first glance. Now for a quick tour around the Paludarium. There we have it, everybody. My first charcoal-inspired mini Paludarium, complete with working waterfall. It took a good while to make, but honestly, I think it looks fantastic. But let me know what you think in the comment section below. If you like this video, be sure to hit like and subscribe for more future videos. And as always, this has been Reptile and More, and I will see you guys on the next one.